Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Lost Voice, where we seek to recover the lost voice of common sense that spoke to Socrates. I'm John Studi with my co-host, Jacob Nelson, and today we are discussing the recovery of St. Thomas Aquinas in our contemporary era. Now, Jake, before we get started here, why don't you let our listeners know a little about yourself?
Well, I am working on my second master's degree. This one is in philosophy with a concentration in ethics. Of course, you're one of my co-students at Holy Apostles College and Seminary. I work in a parish in the Twin Cities of Minnesota, Archdiocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis. And I work with the youth. I work with all the grade levels, 1st through 12th grade. I work with young adults and adults. I kind of ensure formation throughout the parish life. I'm working on all kinds of projects right now, including the New England Didache, which, John, you and I will talk about a little bit here on the radio show as well. I'm married. We have our first child on the way in August, which is so exciting to us. And I'm really looking forward to the show. We're going to talk a little bit about our temperaments here in a little bit in order to really introduce ourselves and how the show is really going to go. John, what about yourself? What do you have to say about yourself?
Well, not a whole lot of good, if I'm going to be honest. But no, I've just recently completed my first master's degree in theology through the Augustine Institute, where I studied primarily discipleship and sacred scripture. But I also really grew in my interest for philosophy by taking a class with Dr. Christopher Bloom on the philosophy of nature and God. And so, as you said, I decided this spring semester, to begin my second master's degree in philosophy through Holy Apostles College and Seminary. Now I intend to eventually continue on to get my doctorate in philosophy, and I have a few different programs that I'm considering with that. But when I'm not doing school, I am more often than not working. I also work in youth ministry primarily. I'm the youth minister and confirmation coordinator down at Nativity of Mary in Bloomington, where I work with all faith formation youth ministry programs from 6th to 12th grade and also facilitate confirmation. In my personal life, I am a father and a husband of 4 years. My wife and I had our first son a year and a half ago. His name's Michael. He's an absolutely wonderful and astounding individual. He's twice as smart and twice as good looking as I will ever be at 18 months old. And so I'm very proud of who he is in all reality here. And I've also recently, as you said, been a part of the founding of the New England Didache, which is an academic journal at Holy Apostles College and Seminary, which is focused on the ressourcement and aggiornamento of classical philosophy and bringing that into the application in our contemporary world. And then,
so ressourcement really is the renewal of classical thought, the renewal of common sense.
Yes.
That's just aggiornamento. The Italian word aggiornamento is the renewal of these things. Ressourcement is going back to the sources.
Yes.
And so if we want to renew the church, if we want to renew just common sense thinking, it doesn't do us any good to reinvent the wheel.
Right.
We need to go back to St. Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, Boethius, some of these great thinkers of the Western world, in order to really recover what it means to be an intellectual animal, a rational animal, to be a man. I think a good point here to just kind of jump off the diving board with is what the Greeks came up with, the four temperaments. John, you and I have worked together for a long time now. We've been friends for 7 wonderful years.
I love you, Jake.
And our first conversation we ever had was in a church basement about the nature of time. And we have differing opinions of how that went, but I feel I won because you weren't even yet Catholic. So, I had some master's work behind me already, but we agree to disagree, I think.
I can definitely disagree with you on that. We agree to disagree. We both can agree that I won that conversation.
In any case, we've been working together and finding better ways to work together for the last 7 years. I think we've really found our stride here in the last year, especially. But I think part of that is understanding our temperaments more. And so, John, maybe give like a 30-second overview of the 4 temperaments, and then talk about your own position within those.
Oh, certainly. 4 temperaments refer to the 4 different bodily fluids that the Greeks believed influence the person's disposition, and they are sanguine of the blood. You have the phlegmatic or the phlegm. You have the choleric, which is, I think, related to the liver, and then also you have the melancholic, which I don't quite remember exactly what organ that was associated with, but these different fluids are at varying levels in each individual, and each one of these fluids influences the way the person responds to the world around them. And now myself, I tend to be a sanguine choleric, and so my personality is one that's very outgoing, very boisterous, very excitable, and I am a raging extrovert. I love people, I love to talk, and I am definitely ostentatious. I don't mind drawing attention to myself.
That's quite obvious already.
Oh, absolutely. I am the most important person in the room, obviously. Except for the Jesus hanging on the wall over there. Or John Paul II, or Mary, or any of the number of saints who I strive to be like. But the sanguine personality also does come with some of its downfalls. For instance, I can be a bit forgetful. I can be a bit impulsive. I can be a little bit thoughtless. And some of those things are a bit of a trade-off when it comes to the positive attributes of being a sanguine. And then the choleric aspect of myself is something that's actually grown more now that I've known you, Jake, and the more closer we've gotten our own friendship. I think I've leached off a little bit of your choleric temperaments, and that has helped me become somebody who is more driven, more firm, more courageous in the face of adversity and hard work that needs to get done, which has just been an absolute boon to my own, not only my own professional and scholastic endeavors, but also my own personal life and growing in virtue. How about you, Jake? What are your temperaments?
Well, I'm primarily choleric. I'm the type A driver personality. I have to get things done. I have to have my office ordered. And really, I'm the kind of personality that affects change, and hopefully positive change if it's coupled with virtue. But really being a driver in our youth ministry program here, I somehow convinced a body of 8 priests to build a room they didn't want to build, and we built a brand new 1,200 square foot youth room by taking out some walls in the old rectory, and the whole project got done. And at the end of it, most of them kind of thought, well, when did that happen? And so the choleric gets things done, and with virtue gets things done well, and for good reasons. My secondary temperament would be melancholic, so I'm a deep thinker. I like to be reserved and really process things internally and think deeply about issues. And John, you're a little different. If we were at the same job here, well, that is quite the understatement. We are very different. But if we were at the same job here and dealing with the same things, we were coworkers, which we're colleagues, but not coworkers at the same parish. But if we were, for you to be rejuvenated and process what's going on in your work field, you would probably want to go down in the break room and talk to people about it. I'm different. I like to walk out of the front door and go on a mile-long walk and just be quiet, prayerful, internal processing, think through it as the melancholic. But both of us being cholerics, then we do something about it. We got to change the thing that isn't working, or we have to drive forward the thing that is working. And I would say most certainly my sanguine personalities come out since knowing you and working with youth, and really getting that charm out in front, and getting people on my side and work in the room and all of those things. And so, for anybody listening to this, your temperaments, you have a primary and a secondary, but you're not limited to that. Really, each person has all 4 at different times, but you have a primary and secondary for the most part. And the people in your life, the people you surround yourself with, they can certainly draw out those other temperaments as well. And the most well-rounded people understand how to draw on all 4 temperaments at various times in their life. The one we didn't talk about is phlegmatic. Phlegmatics, they kind of go with the flow. They accept things kind of as they are. They're the peacemakers. Anything else you want to add about them, John?
Well, I can say that I've been I've been a phlegmatic before, and like Jake was saying, all of us have all four of the various temperaments in different levels, and I have to say, before I really started working more closely with Jake and also just making some changes in my own habits of thinking and acting, I was more of a phlegmatic person. Now, not to say that I've lost the virtues that come with being phlegmatic. I can definitely say that I'm a peacemaker, but some of the vices that come along with being a phlegmatic is, not being driven, not really doing what needs to get done to change things that need to be changed, and that's a vice I've recently been able to overcome through the grace of the Holy Spirit and through the virtuous friendships that I've built with Jake and others. So we can definitely always improve yourselves. Don't lock yourself into these things. These are not horoscopes. They're just ways of helping us understand the way that we react to the world and the way we process things.
Really understand our natural tendencies,
yes.
Our personalities, our
right.
gifts, our talents, all those things. Now, we want to actually get into the program here, and again, we had mentioned that this is really a function that's come out of the New England Didache, another medium, not just print, but another medium to really recover the lost voice of common sense, the lost voice of classical philosophy, classical theology, and it's something that our world is so desperate for, very desperate for truth, for what is real. We're confronted with things that are unreal all the time, and one of those unreal things we were talking about just getting into the show is something that Dennis Prager was speaking of, about there being, some 70-some genders now considered.
Right. Well, he was interviewing, I forget the name of the lady, but she's actually Catholic, which wasn't surprising from some of the language she used. I mean, I've definitely heard her talking about the complementarity of man and woman, and definitely using a lot of the language that you find in the Theology of the Body from John Paul II. And so that was absolutely wonderful to listen to. But what wasn't so wonderful to listen to was these insane distinctions that people are making nowadays. If you hop onto Facebook and make a new profile, you go on there to select your gender, and there's like 70-some-odd genders. And it's like, where did this come from? And then, there's gender fluid, and I'm like, I don't want anything to do with your gender fluids, honestly. Don't tell me about these things.
Well, no, the last time I was on Facebook was probably about 10 years ago. I got rid of mine because I was tired of just the fake friendships and the people hide behind screens. And I was somebody in I think that must have been late teens, early 20s. I really wanted to get off of Facebook because I was just tired of the falsehood, the fake friendships. I wanted something that was real, and that's really, part of what this radio show is too, is reaching out to the millennial generation, Generation Y, Generation X, these, and of course anybody beyond that as well, but really trying to bring back to the fore what is real. And I wanted to get off Facebook 10 years ago because I was just sick of it, and people wouldn't call it. It was friendships of convenience. You would talk.
Absolutely.
You would talk because you were on Facebook together.
Yes.
So and you wouldn't talk beyond that. You wouldn't call each other outside of that. But now hearing this, I'm glad I got off Facebook 10 years ago.
Absolutely. and then it creates an echo chamber too, so you only really hear your own point of view. And then, speaking of real friendships, and I'm going to get back to this whole idea of reality, which is really what I want to touch on with the conversation with Dennis Prager, was, I remember a couple of years ago, a friend of mine who I was pretty good friends with in my undergraduate work, she sent me a message, and we just chatted and we talked, and then all of a sudden she drops this line on me: "Hey, would you like to meet up to learn about these special knives that I'm selling? They're the greatest knives you'll ever see, and you need them right now." I was thinking, honestly, we haven't talked in years, we had a great relationship, and now you're coming back to me because you want to sell me something.
So you just got totally used to sell something to
I got totally used for a utilitarian purpose. She was trying to engage me as a person, but she wasn't actually engaging me as a person. She was playing to that need that we all have to be known, to be loved,
right.
To make herself money. And now, of course, when you're doing sales, you always need to make that person connection, make the person laugh and everything. But usually when you're doing sales, you're upfront about it. You're not trying to deceive the person to think you're trying to...
Well, if you're a good salesman, a good salesman is going to understand the person. Mm-hmm. They're going to see the need that the person has and then sell to that need. I think, and we need to get back to the idea that Dennis Prager was getting at in this interview, but when I worked at a a corporation that I won't name, it was really talked about kind of the revolutionary way that Steve Jobs sold things for Apple, was that he didn't create things for the need of the market. He created something that then created the need. I mean, nobody needed an iPad, but once it hit the market, the need was there.
I'm pretty sure we need not to have them.
We need not to have them, yes. There's a great book out there about, I think, what if Aristotle's kid had an iPad?
Oh, yeah, I want to read that one.
My wife reads it, loves it. But in any case, Steve Jobs revolutionized this idea where you don't sell the product you have to an existing need. You create a need based on the product that you want to make. And maybe that's kind of gotten into our mentalities where we use people for the sake of what we want to do. But getting back to this idea of 70-some genders.
Right. Well, one thing he asked on there, he said he's been contemplating this for years and years and years. And the woman who wrote the book, and I'm really sorry, I can't quite remember what the book was called. I think the book was called Sex Scandal or something like that. And the scandal was the distinction between men and women, and then the whole transgender movement. And he asked, why is it that people are moving towards trying to erase the distinction between men and women? And then are we trying to make them the same? Are we trying to erase universal human nature? Or what's the deal? And so when I was thinking this, I mean, there's obviously a number of ways you can answer the question why. And one of the things that I was thinking is that when we have people who have bought into a modernist understanding of the way reality is, it's ultimately one that's nominalistic. And by the way, I remember now, the name of the book was Sex Scandal, The Desire to Abolish Male and Female, and it's by Ashley McGuire. Looks like a great read, and the woman's very insightful and charming, so I definitely recommend the book, even though I haven't read it, but I'm very impressed by her disposition and her intelligent insight.
So you're recommending the book. Is she herself saying that there is such a thing as 76 genders, or is she saying that this is what's out there and the philosophy behind it is so on and so forth? I mean, where is she coming from, if you're willing to recommend this?
Sure. Where she's coming from is actually the Catholic point of view, but she doesn't necessarily express it in theological terms. She very cleverly speaks about it in terms that are that carry more moral authority in our society through science and through sociology and psychology, showing that there truly is a distinction between man and woman, even on the side of the natural sciences, let alone metaphysics. And then when I was looking at this issue, again, to get back to the reason why how I would answer Dennis Prager's question, is that there are really fundamentally two different worldviews that are at play here. The secularist mindset is entirely nominalistic, following after William of Ockham, who denied essential natures. Who, you'll hear this a lot, I think William of Ockham ruined everything.
Now, for those listening that may not have heard terms like nominalistic,
right? And
what is this?
So nominalism, the word itself, when you break it apart, essentially means that when we speak of things in the world and we use universal identifiers or terms like trees, we're not speaking of an essence or like an actual presence that's in the trees that makes them a tree, but rather we're just giving them a name. We're giving them a mental category by which we are able to call them what they are, and it's only kind of a common name between them.
So really a nominalist would say that we can't actually understand the thing itself.
Right.
We just understand kind of the name we give it.
Yes,
we can
exactly.
talk about trees because there may be some similar characteristics that we perceive, but we can't really know what a tree is.
Right.
Okay.
And so the difference between this modernist understanding and the classical understanding that's adopted by most Christians, whether it be intentional or not, and that's also adopted by classical philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, and so forth, is they're essentialists. They believe that there is a real nature in things that's not just a name that we give it. Rather, it's something we discover and something we come to know. Mm-hmm. It's not always easy to discover, and when we do discover it, we don't always have it in have a clear understanding of it.
Well, such as the allegory of Plato's cave.
Yeah, like the allegory of Plato's cave in a lot of ways, yes.
The prisoners are held captive in the cave. They see the shadows on the wall. They think the shadows are real, only to be released into the natural sunlight. And, as we all wake up in the morning and our spouses or parents or whoever turn the lights on us, burns our eyes and things are a little blurry.
Yes.
So we might see them, but, we might not fully comprehend what we're seeing once we come out of the darkness.
Right, exactly. And I think that the differences that we're seeing here in opinion on whether or not gender, there are like 76 genders or whatever, and whether there are two genders, which is the classical worldview, is that when you compare the two metaphysical or the two worldview foundational worldviews of those two systems of belief, and then you apply thought, which all thought is making distinctions, then what happens is that those who are of the modern and nominalistic mindset make divisions according to the names that they give them, whereas the classical philosophy and the classical way of thinking makes distinctions according to reality. And so what we're seeing here, I think, is the playing out of the consequences of a worldview that denies essential realities to things in the world.
So, as you were saying that, I was thinking of some of my formation from Ave Maria, and in that time we talked quite a bit about transcendental properties of being, which these properties are things that pervade all being. So the three common ones we speak of are truth, goodness, and beauty. All things that exist have truth, goodness, and beauty to some degree, according to their nature. There's three other ones we don't talk about, and one of which is individuality. So everything is individual from all other things. It seems like what's going on in the culture, and this is just hypothesis, of course, but there's this drive for individuality because, let's be honest, if we're talking about biology, there's a man and there's a woman. And, of course, nature's act for the most part. There could be a hermaphrodite that's born or somebody who has both genitalia or something that's born, but that doesn't negate from the fact that there's really genitalia that's proper to man and a set that's proper to woman.
Yes.
So when we speak biologically, we talk about the sex, there are two options, right?
Oh, yeah.
But now we're not talking about, on Facebook with all these different, gender fluidity kind of things. We're not talking about sex, we're talking about gender, which seems like what we're driving at is this mental, emotional association with how they live their sexuality out. So they're not necessarily denying that they have male or female genitalia. What they're arguing is that they have an individual way of how they wish to live that out in their life. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's issues with that idea too, but go
right.
Yeah.
So if gender really now is the idea of how we're living our sex out, it seems like people are driving at the transcendental of wanting to be individual, but they have the false understanding of what individuality really means. They think it's a separation from the reality of what it means to be human. And so now they're wishing to live their sexuality out, call it gender, and now there's 76 ways we can live that out. When in reality, they're not seeing that by being fully man or fully woman, living out the virtues proper to who they are, that's what makes you individual. You're individual according to grace, according to virtue. God wants us to be individual according to how He made us, not individual according to how we desire to be made.
Or desire to express ourselves.
Or desire to how we express
Define
ourselves.
Our
right,
yes.
Right.
That's great. One of the things that gets me is, people do also seek to change their sex as well, whether it be through surgery or through the way that they dress.
But they're changing their biological sex according to what they perceive their gender to be.
Right.
And this reminds me, we can maybe go a little bit down the road of transcendental, of what truth is. Truth is conforming our mind to what is real.
Yes.
Right? We conform our minds to a reality. Unfortunately, we call that objective truth, right?
Sure.
The objective truth, I look out my window, there's a tree. The sky is blue, the grass is green, these things. I'm conforming my mind, I'm admitting in my mind what this thing is. Unfortunately, in our culture, in our world today, we do the opposite. We conform reality to what we want it to be. We conform reality to our mind. And that all of a sudden makes our minds the center of the universe. We become our own gods, so to speak. And this is really at the fundamental problem of Adam and Eve. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil wasn't Adam and Eve for the first time. Be like, wow, I just discovered good and evil.
Yeah, otherwise God's commandments wouldn't make any sense.
Right, that wasn't it at all.
If they don't know right from wrong, it wouldn't be a sin for them.
Right, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is them deciding for themselves for the first time what is good and evil.
Right.
They're conforming reality to their mind, not their mind to the reality.
And what they're doing is they're also usurping God's position as creator, because later in the Bible it talks about how the king knows the laws of the land. It's not just like he has the intellectual understanding or comprehension or apprehension of what the laws are, but rather it's the person who decides what the laws of the land are. And so in the same way, when they know what's good or evil for them, and there's other imagery within the Genesis account too that would indicate this royal function that Adam and Eve are now taking on. They're actually usurping God's position as king of the universe and creator and saying, God, you might have your own standards for us what's good and evil, but we're going to be like gods now and decide for ourselves what's good and evil. This knowledge is not just an apprehension of certain truths, but it's a trying to dominate. It's an attempt to dominate and control those truths for oneself.
Right.
Yes. And one thing that, not to go back on this too far, one thing that baffles me too is when somebody is born with the organs and the dispositions proper to a male, let's say, and then they say, you know what, I feel like I am not a man, that I really am a woman. It's very difficult for me to understand how somebody could actually feel like something that they are not. I think Thomas Nagel, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's like Thomas Nagel's famous problem about, can we ever know what it's like to be a bat? How could we understand and process reality in the same way a bat does? In the same way, I, as a man, could never understand and process reality in the same way a woman does.
Right.
Because I've never lived that existence. And so how is it possible for somebody to suddenly wake up or suddenly realize that, oh no, I really feel like a woman, when they've never actually been a woman?
And this is very problematic. And right now we're really speaking in general terms. We're speaking on the whiteboard or the chalkboard.
Yeah.
And this is all really important for us as we explore philosophy, we explore theology, we explore what it means in the general world. I mean, we have to confront the philosophical underpinnings of these problems. The accusation, though, can be that if we're only going to look at the philosophical, it can be very cold. We might not care about the individual. And the reality is, people who are struggling with gender identity issues, people who are struggling with sexuality and these things, they are hurting. And, people can argue about the different philosophies behind it, the theologies behind it, God made me this way, God made me that way. And the goal of this show really is to talk about it, but, my master's in theology is not a master's rooted in simply study. It's a master's in pastoral theology.
Right.
And so every time we talk about this, my brain is just constantly going of, well, what does it mean for the individual? The theological term is paranesis. What's the practical application? And so, lest we get too far down the road of philosophy and forget about the individuality of the person who's suffering, the reality is we need to understand the place that people who are struggling with this thing are in. How do we encounter them? Because that's the other part of this, is that we're doing this radio show, we're doing the New England Didache, not for the sake of study in and of itself. We're not here to just talk about theological terms or lament the things going on in our culture. But really the goal is, how do we take this and then engage the culture? How do we actually work with our brother, our sister, our cousin, our coworker who's struggling with gender identity issues? How can we actually work with them and show them the love of God, but also the common sense of what and the beauty of what it means to be male and female? Where do we find, or how do we apply the truth, goodness, and beauty of what it means to be of the two sexes, complementary, and serving one another, honoring one another, fulfilling one another in the state of our bodies, and really in the state of our prayer lives, our souls? They're expressed differently, male and female. So how do we do this?
Well, I think that one of the reasons why I'm just going to go from general to more specific is one of the reasons why it's important for us to discuss the theological and philosophical backdrops to these issues is because if we're trying to figure out what's good for a human person, then we need to understand, first of all, what is a human person.
Right.
Kind of like, it would not be good for me to take one of my youth group kids and dig a hole in the ground, plant them in there, and put fertilizer on them and pour water over them, which isn't terribly dissimilar from some of the youth ministry games that we play. But ultimately,
I was just helping you at a retreat last weekend, and I got duct taped to a wall by my small group.
Hey, you know what? That's exactly the kind of stuff we need to go through. But ultimately speaking, if I did that to somebody, or if I did that to myself, and expected it to be the true good for me, I'd die fairly quickly. And so when we look at the truth of the human person and we really think about what is ultimately our nature, then from that we can understand that being planted in the ground and watered is not something that's going to bring about our real happiness. We need so much more than that, because we're so much more than trees. We're so much more than plants. And so starting with the understanding of the truth of the person, and that broad general principle, we can then take that principle and apply it to specific situations. And when it comes to the specific situations, whether it be somebody who's struggling with, and we're going to be talking about sexual disorders, or sexual moral disorders here, pornography, contraception, transgender issues, homosexuality, whatever it might be, if we have a broad understanding of what it means to be a person, we can apply it to these different situations in order to express the truth to them in a way that is both loving and corrective. And one of the things I think is most especially important is that it's very difficult for us to talk to somebody about these very sensitive issues, especially in a culture that is so emotive in its way of thinking about reality and way of thinking about dialogue, that unless we have a very strong relationship with a person, then it's gonna usually do more harm than good to approach them about these issues. And so, the two things I mainly recommend for approaching a person who is struggling with any disorder of any moral disorder whatsoever is to number one, have the proper principles in place in order to speak to them, but then also have that strong relationship, because there's always that trite saying, which is nobody cares what you know until they know how much you care. It's true, and it's so basic, and you hear it all the time, but it's a very true principle that I sometimes think we forget, even in areas of things like catechesis. And,
so I think in a very simple way we can just say we need to move from principle to practical.
Principle practical.
So many of us, we get inundated with having to practice principles, right? We, in a simple way, Christmas with the family. Issues come up. We have to deal with the practical right there. And the problem is, so many of us don't know what the principles are that we're operating out of. I mean, we go to Mass, we go to confession, we're good Catholics, we might read, we listen to radio shows, we do all of these things, but so many of us don't get down to just the nitty-gritty. What is the basic principle that we are working with? It's kind of like, if we want to end up in San Diego, right? We live in Minnesota, and we're just getting out of winter now, so we're, it's been a nice winter, but normally we're shoveling ourselves out until June. We want to get to San Diego, right? Well, that's kind of the principle of travel, right? Well, how do we do it practically? If we only have a weekend, do we practice that by driving? Well, probably not. We have to understand kind of what our principle is of how much time we have off, all that kind of stuff. So, then we have to figure out, well, maybe it's best to fly. Well, do we have the money? We have to discern these things, but we can't practice it unless we have the principles in place. What's our budget? What's our time frame? And so we have to move from principle to practical. And so that means we have to know our principles, and that's kind of our goal here. The other thing I would say, and I know you're with me on this, is Socratic dialogue.
Yay.
It's one of our favorite things.
Absolutely.
I think on the show we need to do some Socratic dialogue from time to time. What do you think, Studi?
Well, what do you mean by think, Jake? Please.
What do you mean by think?
Go on. I mean, if you're going to ask me what I'm thinking about something, you have to tell me what you mean by that.
As a brilliant politician once said recently, it depends on what you mean by is.
Yes. Yeah.
What is.
Oh, and I've had conversations about that statement.
So, Socratic dialogue, though, and I found this to be immensely helpful in dealing with difficult situations, working with people who might not believe what we believe, because it's, what was that principle that you said about caring and
nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care.
Right. And the amazing thing is, you can diffuse a difficult situation very easily by asking good questions.
Right.
I mean, it's what doctors do, right? You come in, you were just at the doctor, you go in there, and what do? They don't just give you medicine, right? What do? They ask questions.
Yeah, I got to find out what's wrong first, or what's going on, or what you need. Yeah.
And so we should act the same. We shouldn't just go in and throw medicine at people of, okay, well, you believe this, you're wrong here, and you're wrong there. Ask good questions. John, you and I were down at the Minnesota State Fair, what was that, about 4 or 5 years ago now?
Something like that.
In our state, we were trying to pass legislation that affirmed marriage as being between one man and one woman. And this was pushed by our archbishop and by the diocese, and the constitutional amendment failed in our state. Not by a lot, but it did fail. But anyway, we were down at our state fair, and I remember this so vividly. We were down there with a few of our friends, and we were at the Vote Yes booth. And the Vote Yes meant that you affirmed that you believed in marriage being between one man and one woman. Well, a couple of our friends, maybe you were a part of that, got into an interview with one of the Vote No people. Were you in that?
Yeah, I hardly said a thing. So my other friend was very verbose.
So I decided I wasn't going to be a part of that interview because I had the foresight to know that they could edit what I said however they wanted to edit it. And sure enough, our friend that was very vocal was edited and made to look very poor.
I'll note the one thing that I got in there on, I called him on a red herring fallacy, and it stayed on there because it had to for his own spin. So I was very happy I got that on.
Yeah, so that's good. But so I decided to sit down and pray divine mercy for the group, and within a few minutes there's a group forming behind me and getting louder and louder and louder. And yelling about how we're not a Christian nation and how dare you talk about this way with homosexual unions and you're a bigot and you're hateful, all this stuff. And there was about 15 people there on the Vote No side. There was one woman affirming marriage between one man and one woman. And her argument was, well, I don't believe that. Well, that's not true. That's not effective.
No, not at all.
And I was praying to God that somebody would go and help her. And I'm thinking, well, as long as I keep praying, somebody's going to come help. Well, I was ignoring the fact that God was calling me. So eventually I stood up. And I think about halfway through this conversation, John, you joined in. But I remember I just stood up and I asked a question. Okay, well, if you guys think that we're not founded on Christian principles, why does that matter? How does that apply to the debate right now? Because marriage between one man and one woman is not strictly a Christian good. And half of them immediately just left. The only thing they wanted to do was yell.
Sure.
They didn't care about what the truth was. And once they encountered a good question, well, their colors were shown. They just left. Well, it left me with about 5 or 6 teenage high school girls. Well, this is my job as a youth minister, so I'm thinking, well, I'm in my wheelhouse right here. Let's talk to some teenagers. And all I did was ask them questions. Okay, well, what's the point in marriage?
Mm-hmm.
why do people get married? John, maybe humor me. Please, can you play a teenage girl for me?
Because they love each other.
Oh, they love each other. Absolutely, they love each other. This is a great answer. Well, what is love?
Baby, don't hurt me.
Baby, don't hurt. Exactly. Baby, don't hurt me.
Exactly. No, love is that feeling that you have deep down inside when you look at somebody and you just know that you love them.
So love is a feeling.
Yeah, love is a feeling.
Okay. So if you think love is a feeling, what about married couples that have been together for 30 or 40 years, and they've gone through financial difficulties, and they have had difficulties with their married life or with their kids, and they come to a particular week or month in their marriage 20, 30 years down the line, and they're just not feeling it. They can't stand to look at each other. Did they stop loving each other?
I don't know. I don't think so.
So you would argue that maybe love goes beyond feeling.
Yeah, I guess, but I don't know how we can talk about love without talking about feeling.
Well, feelings are included.
Okay.
But if you want to go out on a date and you want to discover love with somebody, don't you have to make that choice? It doesn't just happen, does it?
Yeah, I guess, you also have to make a choice.
So love includes choice.
Right, okay.
So love, even when it's not feeling good, you're still choosing to do it then, right? You can still choose to love even if it doesn't feel good. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. I've done that before too, yeah.
Okay, you love your parents, you love your siblings, whatever, even when it's not easy. So you would agree that love goes beyond mere feeling.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So we'll break away from our little role play here. We carried on this conversation for the better part of a half an hour. And eventually they got frustrated with all my questions, and they said, okay, well, if you're so smart, what do you think love is? And I said, well, it's desiring the best for the beloved. And they all just stopped. It was really weird. Like, teenage high school girls stopped talking. And now I'm overgeneralizing.
And they're angry here, too.
They're angry, yeah. But they stopped talking, and you can see the wheels spinning in their head of what's being said. And I said, well, you girls, think about it. If you want to be loved, don't you want a guy to love you for who you are, not what you do? And you could see the hearts coming out of their eyes.
Oh, yes, I remember this story very well.
Their hearts are melting, and they're seeing in rose-colored glasses, and they're thinking of their amazing spouse of the future, of loving them for who they are. Not because things are easy or they feel good, but because of that. So, entering in the Socratic dialogue, it really diffused the situation, and it engaged the individual. I mean, if I'm asking questions, it's showing that A, I care about that person, but B, it also it forces them to define their terms.
Yes.
Because if your idea of love is different from my idea of love, then we're going to talk past each other.
Absolutely.
And if I just give you my idea of love, it doesn't matter because you're going to shut down. But if I ask you what yours is, and I hear what you have to say, well, now I can, in my mind, start forming, okay, they think this about love, I think this about love. Let's discuss the notion of love. Because by me asking the question, it disarms the situation. Now they feel vulnerable enough to put their idea out there. Now there's something to talk about, because you're talking about the terminology. You're talking about what is it to love somebody. We're talking about principles now, and this is important because if you just talk about practice, it becomes vulnerable. It becomes focused on, well, you're a bigot, you're hateful, well, how dare you tell me how to act. But if we go back to principle, if we form good principles in people, then we can hopefully just trust them to follow the practice of those good principles. And they need guidance, of course. But
I've experienced the same thing too, and that's where I think it's a scholastic axiom to say that errors in the beginning small errors in the beginning lead to large errors in the end. I don't remember exactly if that's the exact terminology, but if you start from the wrong place, even if you reason well, you're going to end up in a very wrong position.
Right.
If you start from the premise that all men are green and Socrates is a man, then you say Socrates is green.
Right.
And that's really not right. I'm sure Socrates isn't a Martian. He's a human. Humans tend not to be green.
Well, maybe he likes the garden.
I mean, he could be garden. Well, we're equivocating on green. Are we talking about his physical qualities here? Or are we talking about his passions and habits?
Well, maybe he uses solar power to power his home. So
he could be. Green. Maybe he has chlorophyll instead of blood supplying him. I don't know. We're absurd. That's fine. Anyway, and so I've done the same thing with a student recently for confirmation. I've been meeting with them and just having conversations with them with parts of the faith that they may struggle with. And there was a guy who came in. He comes from a family that's they come to church a lot, but they're very, very liberal. And they disagree with the church on just about every social issue.
Well, let's pause there, though, and this is something that I nail everybody for.
You're right. I'm sorry. I know what you're going to say.
The church is not liberal or conservative.
Right. It's
it is
Catholic. Yeah.
And so the distinguishment is orthodox and heterodox. There are certain positions in the church, and this is a whole nother episode.
Absolutely.
But there are positions in the church that correspond more to the liberal ideals, and some that correspond more to the conservative ideals. And so when we talk about this, and we should have another show about this, this is fascinating stuff, especially when we get into how churches live out their missions and when we get around election years and those things. But we talk about people who are orthodox and heterodox. Orthodox being the people who believe in the true faith, and the heterodox, those who maybe equivocate on the faith. I have a great story about this, if we have time for it, by the end of this episode. But anyway, you're dealing with people down at your parish about their heterodox.
Yeah, their heterodox views. I mean, and politically speaking, they're very liberal as well, and very leftist, which is also a distinction that we can talk about sometime too. But his biggest issue was on gay marriage, and I'm not going to go into the full details of the story here, but I just simply asked him questions, and I know from the conversations I've had with him and his mother that they are very, very emotional. They're very, very passionate about their beliefs. And some of the stories I heard about this guy, when you have conversations with him, when you're arguing with him, especially that point-counterpoint apologetics, and like, oh, I believe this, and then, oh, no, this is wrong because of this. Where you're going back and forth like that, it can often just escalate a situation. Right. So what I knew I needed to do, because when our passions start taking over our reasoning or our decision making, then we're not thinking clearly, and we're not going to be intentionally and reasonably heading to the right conclusion. So what I did was employ the Socratic dialogue, and so in the course of 2.5 hours, we talked for a very long time, I got him to define justice on his own terms, love, sexuality, and rights. And within all four, when we defined all four of those terms and started talking, and also in the nature of marriage, when we actually got all of those 5 things together, we landed square in the center of all these little circles that marriage can only be between one man and one woman for a lifelong relationship that's open to life, that's free, full, and faithful.
And once the kid said that, his jaw probably hit the floor.
Yeah, he was happy. That was like one of the most astounding things I've seen in my entire life, was that he disproved his own beliefs. After he went in, disagreed with the church on marriage, and then came out of it agreeing with the church on marriage, and excitedly, enthusiastically believing and affirming the church's teaching. And this was just phenomenal. And the difference between that kind of result and the conversations I had with like that reporter that I had interviewed with, or people I've talked about in the past, especially about things like gay marriage and abortion, is just night and day. Yeah. It's astounding what you can do simply by asking somebody to define their own terms.
Well, and this comes all the way back again. Define your terms, work on principles, and apply the principle. We are not what does Cain say? I'm not my brother's keeper. Well, we are our brother's keeper, but that doesn't mean that we tell people how they ought to live. True freedom is doing what one ought to do. It's doing the right, the good thing. Yep. But it's not for us to go around and tell people, look, what you're doing is wrong. I mean, there's a place for it sometimes, depending on your relationship.
Yes, relationship.
But really what we need to do is help people understand common sense, understand principles, help them engage the philosophical corner of their brain that's been killed by media, social media, news media, all this crap that's out there. Our ability is to wonder and have awe about reality has been absolutely destroyed. And when you're talking about this kid, he was coming from a position of, well, this is what the culture is saying, and and I guess I don't disagree, so I must agree, because he didn't have the principles in place. Once you led him in those questions to good principles, he understood that, well, that must be what's real. And if I'm going to be intellectually honest, I better conform my mind to that real thing. And so he's engaging in the truth.
Right, and that's actually one of the things that, going back to our social media, the fake relationships that I've noticed. I do take part in Facebook debates on occasion, and part of it is simply to exercise my own ability to wade through those kind of arguments. And one thing that I notice is that if somebody asks you a question that you can't quite answer according to the conclusion you already have predetermined, you take a very long time to get back to them, get back to that person who asked you that question. However, and so it's very fake. It allows you an opportunity to be dishonest and to come back with sophistry instead of philosophy. And so having those kind of conversations in person is something that I think is absolutely essential for us to develop not only a worldview that's consistent with reality, but also the virtues that are necessary for us to navigate the world and to be honest with ourselves and with others. And I think that's something that we're missing. And then you talk about the loss of wonder, and this is whole other episode on education.
Well, it sounds like we already have about 2 or 3 months worth of episodes.
Oh, this is fantastic. We should be writing this stuff down. But I think that our school system destroys wonder in kids.
Right.
There was a study that I saw recently that compared classical education, a classical school in a Lutheran church in the similar area and everything. They eliminated a lot of the variables to a public school. Not public school, another Lutheran school. They use a traditional model that people see in public schools. And what was really fascinating is that you saw a switch in the earlier years. So in the elementary level, there was a lack of there was more progress and more learning that happened in the traditional model. But there was a switch in about 6th grade where the classical model just shot way past the performance levels of the traditional model. And one of the things that the author of the study had identified was the interest in learning, and also the ability to learn, because classical education focuses on developing virtues, developing habits of thought, and helping kids know how to be learners instead of just test takers. Whereas the traditional model, because of all the standardized testing we have, focuses on that. But that's a whole different episode.
And really the core of this is engaging the whole of the person.
Right. Yeah.
We in the West are so good at analyzing.
Yeah.
We are extremely good at breaking things down into their component parts and then specializing in those component parts. And we need this. We need to have...
It's a success story with modern sciences.
Right. We need oncologists. Yes. Right. I wouldn't want, say, a podiatrist or a proctologist to be my oncologist. That just wouldn't work so well, right? So it's good we have specialties, but it's come at the expense of synthesis.
Yes.
It's come at the expense of seeing the whole picture and seeing the common thread through many things. And that's why the classical model takes a little longer, because you're developing these habits. But then once the kids hit a certain age, they can see the whole picture, and it's really quite fascinating to the human mind. And so it's engaging the whole of the human person.
Right.
And it would be interesting to do a study on this, but why these Facebook debates don't go anywhere, because what we're doing is we're hiding the human person behind a screen.
Yep. That
human person is putting their human thought out into the cyber world, but the person reading it has no sense of their humanity. And so because there's no sense of the humanity, you're dealing with essentially a Word document.
Yep.
You're fighting with a Word document. Well, how many of us back in the days of, before autosave, would we fight Word documents and get angry and punch our keyboard or, something of that nature because we lost a whole work? Well, it's really no different when it comes to Facebook. We're not dealing with humanity. We're dealing with electronics.
Right.
But then that human person who posited their first thought sees an attack, and now it escalates. It's not a human interaction. It's two people interacting with their own computer screens.
Right.
There's no sharing of the human person back and forth. And when we lose that humanity, we lose the totality, the whole picture of the argument.
You're right, and that's one of the things I really appreciate about Peter Kreeft's book on Socratic logic is he identifies what 49 material fallacies, and one of my favorite ones is winning the argument but losing the arguer. And I think that's something that happens so often both online, but also because we become habituated to arguing about these things online, that when we bring it into a real life situation where you have to have these discussions, then what happens is you're used to seeing somebody who holds an opposite point of view as this characterization of evil, or this characterization of their point of view. And so
they must be evil because they don't agree with me.
And so when you have that conversation with them, it's not a sharing the human person. You automatically dehumanize them. I remember there was a girl at my parish who we had a great relationship, and at one point, we were talking about struggles she was having. Her mom was invested in the whole conversation and everything, but then she changed her mind about the struggles that she was having and decided to disagree with the church again, and then she separated herself from me, and then when I would talk to her, or when I would hear about the way she would talk about me, suddenly I'm no longer John, the guy she looks up to and comes to for advice and loves and everything.
Right.
Suddenly I'm a bigot, I'm a homophobe, I am somebody who is just ignorant and intolerant.
Well, because you represented for her the antithesis to her argument.
Yeah.
It didn't matter that you were a human person. It didn't matter you were the youth minister.
Yeah.
It didn't matter that you had a degree or 2 degrees or 15 degrees. And quite frankly, it didn't really matter. Nothing of it mattered. It didn't matter your position, none of it, because she wanted affirmation of what she thought. She was not willing to engage in the truth.
Right. And what was really interesting is her mom, who supports me in a relationship that I had with this girl, but she doesn't support the church teaching. She actually challenged her daughter and said, "Tell me how he was being a bigot. Tell me how he was being a homophobe." And she said, and the girl it was just so funny. I heard that, and she said, "Well, I can't because he's not, but he is because he disagrees with me. Because he says something." And so just like, what are you thinking? Where is this coming from?
This all gets back to the point that people don't know how to engage in conversation.
Yes.
They don't know how to debate. They don't know what rhetoric is, because quite frankly, the classical idea of rhetoric is to posit an argument, to posit a position, and move back and forth. Rhetoric today is let's twist the words out there to fit what we want.
Well, it's sophistry.
It is sophistry.
Yeah, and what was it? Yeah, so it's going right back to the point of our show, the lost voice, recovering that lost voice of wisdom that first spoke to Socrates in Athens, 2,400 years ago, however long it's been, and trying to bring that back into engagement with the modern times. And this is this is one of the reasons why I'm such an advocate of promoting Thomas Aquinas, actually. And I've had people talk about Aquinas as somebody who's just wholly inaccessible. I remember having a conversation a couple of years ago with one of my coworkers, and they were talking about doing a Passover Seder. My thought was, I think I remember reading that St. Thomas thought that celebrating Passover was a sin for Christians. And I'm like, I should look that up, because he's the universal doctor of the church.
Right.
And, the popes and bishops and all sorts of people have said that he's somebody that we should really listen to when it comes to understanding our faith.
Right.
And my coworker threw her hands up and was just like, who cares? Nobody understands Thomas Aquinas anyway. But then it was just like, when I went back to read the Summa, and it was this very, very, very clear argument that he gave. He essentially said that when it comes to religious practices that do nothing to profit the faith, and he applied it to a passage in Galatians, and I'm just going to summarize here, which basically says things that do not profit the faith lead to sin. Mm-hmm. And then so he said, if practicing the Passover doesn't profit the faith, then it's a sin. And so it was a super easy argument. There's no ambiguity to that.
Right.
And much of St. Thomas Aquinas is just like this. And I suggest Aquinas because he is this incredible philosopher of common sense. He has really tried to dissect reality in a way that makes it not only real but also pastorally applicable. And I know you're a big fan of Thomas Aquinas.
Absolutely. I think we have to wrap up here soon for the hour of our program. So next week what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, I think, the matters of justice. It seems like justice is a huge issue as we talk about this: social justice,
sure.
Divine justice, natural law, all these things. And this really is, we need to apply to the beginning of Thomas Aquinas. If we look at the first article in the Summa Theologia, Thomas talks about how if God wanted to save man, then he really needed to reveal himself to man. Absolutely. Because it's only through an admixture of many, many errors and over a long, long time that only very few men come to understand that there's one God. But even then, they don't understand who he is, only a little bit of what he is. And so I think for next week, what we ought to do is crack open our Summas, read a little bit of the Summa, and really start to break down Thomas's arguments. And related, I think, would be very beneficial, since we want to go from principle to practical.
Sure.
Take the principles Thomas gives and look at the principles of justice and apply it to today, because we have such a poor understanding of justice and a poor understanding of revelation that we really need to explore this. Just one quick story on that, as I promised. I've encountered some priests around me as of late that posit the argument that the entirety of the Bible is a myth. They have no idea. There's no witnesses to the Old Testament, they say, and so we can't take it as real. I mean, how ridiculous. Even if Adam and Eve had no particular witness that could hand down the faith, isn't God a witness? I mean, don't we believe that the Bible is divinely inspired?
Yeah,
this is ridiculous.
What has St. Augustine said? I only believe in the Gospels because the Catholic Church told me so.
Right.
Yeah, it's the miracle.
So we need to look at miracles and credible witnesses and all these things. And so even if these priests think these ludicrous ideas about Scripture, we need to understand Thomas here, and the principle Thomas gives is that God, if we believe in a God and we believe in sin, we need to understand that God, who loves us, desires to save us, and as a result he must reveal himself to us to cover the infinite gap between us and him.
Sure.
And so I think with that, we'll wrap up today, leaving on those notes. We'll look at St. Thomas Aquinas next week, as well as the matters of justice, and learn how those apply to our lives so that we can better engage the culture. This is the Lost Voice program, where we seek to recover the lost voice of common sense that spoke to Socrates. And signing off, Jacob Nelson, and of course my co-host, John Studi. And we look forward to talking about Thomas next week.
All right, thank you, Jake, so much. We'll see you all later.
And God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.